Welcome to the Texas News Podcast, where we dive into all things Texas and the future of independence in the state of Texas. On today's show, we're going to be discussing a little known fact about the Battle of the Alamo, something most people don't know. And we're going to be talking about how that impacts our motivations for independence moving forward. So don't go anywhere. Well, thank you so very much for joining me for another episode of the Texas News Podcast. And today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We are, as I'm recording this, it is March the 3rd. It is the day after Texas Independence Day. And anyone who knows about me or the TNM or really Texans in general, this is the high holy days. This is kind of where Texans of all stripes, even more moderate Texans, and I'm not talking politically, I'm talking about the toe dippers that may be sort of in or out of being a Texan, depending on the political situation. But even the more moderate Texans feel just a little more Texan during this time. I was explaining it to someone the other day that doesn't live in Texas and saying, look, this really begins for us. When we start talking about the calendar year, you've got the February 23rd, the anniversary of the start of the Battle of the Alamo. Then you've got a couple of days later or a day later, you've got Colonel Travis, the anniversary of Colonel Travis's letter that became famous from the Alamo, his victory or death letter. Then, as you move on, you have all of these various milestones. March 2nd, Texas Independence Day. This day, March 3rd, which I'm going to get into why it's important in this podcast. But then you move on to March the 5th, which is the anniversary of when Travis drew the famous line in the sand. Then March the 6th, where you have the anniversary of the fall of the Alamo. Then you get into things like the anniversary of the drafting of the Texas Constitution, the runaway scrape, leading up to April the 21st, which is San Jacinto Day, the day that Texas won its independence on the battlefield at San Jacinto. And we'll be doing a lot of special things related to this time of year. But for me, I wanted to dedicate this particular podcast. I mean, I could have done one for Texas Independence Day. And granted, I did release a special message that is available on all the platforms. It's on YouTube, it's on Rumble, it's on X, it's on TNM Social. I mean, it's out there. So you can go back and watch that if you'd like. It's about 10 minutes, and I would encourage you to do so. But I really wanted to reserve the podcast for this special day. And I know a lot of people will scratch their heads and they look at March the 3rd and they're like, okay, well, it's the day after Texas Independence Day. I mean, big whoop. It's not like Boxing Day equivalent for Texas Independence Day. They may look in and go, okay, well, we're getting close to the end of the siege of the Alamo. We're getting close to the anniversary of the fall of the Alamo, but we're not quite there yet. And they wonder, what is so special about March the 3rd? And for me, this has been honestly probably since the moment, not the exact moment, but sometime within months of when I crossed the proverbial line in the sand in August of 1996. I became aware of this, and it was something that we were not taught in school. In fact, it actually, I found out about it through I guess an op-ed that someone had written in favor of Texas independence, referring to the Alamo curse. And I mean, I got to tell you, in the pre-clickbait era, that was about the most clickbait title that you could possibly imagine. But I was completely unaware of the existence of this until then. And from that moment forward, it really has captivated me. I mean, it really, if I'm looking at pieces and parts of things that have really led to my particular worldview on the issue of Texas independence, it really is this particular thing that I'm talking about today. And so I alluded to this a moment ago where I talked about Travis's famous letter from the Alamo. And, you can and I'm not going to dwell on it, but just to set the scene so you understand the context. When the siege of the Alamo began, they had, very few men inside the mission. And Travis, seeking assistance and help after basically the entire Mexican army dumped on top of him, he penned a pretty famous letter, sending it to the convention. And for those of you who don't know, it was not like a dentist convention. It was a convention that had gathered at Washington on the Brazos to decide on what the future of Texas was going to be. Was Texas going to pursue its rights under the Mexican Constitution of 1824, or was it going to pursue independence? And I could do an entire podcast episode and actually might at some point, talking about the dual mindset that people in Texas had at the time. There's a very, very interesting letter that I came across some years back that was published in a Texas almanac that really speaks to the divide in the minds of Texans and the analogs that you can draw to our current situation, where you have people that really just want to continue to pursue states' rights under the federal system versus people like us who believe that independence is the path forward. That divide existed in 1835 and 1836, honestly, up until March the 2nd, when independence was declared. But Travis penned a letter essentially calling for aid, and it was to the convention, but it was addressed to the people of Texas and all Americans in the world. And like I said, I'm not going to go through that entire letter, but it became really famous as a very brief, I guess, introduction to the plight of the defenders of the Alamo to the greater world. And it was so concise and it was so motivating and moving that it is naturally the letter that became famous. It really was to everyone that was alive at the time. Travis wanted as much help as he could possibly get. And so, it became widely circulated. And to think that it really came from the pen of Travis, who was, in his mid 20s at the time, essentially, it still is pretty fascinating. But what you don't learn, what they don't teach you, is that there were other letters from Colonel Travis. And the ones that really have captivated me, and really one in particular, were a series of dispatches that were sent from the Alamo, snuck through enemy lines, that went to the convention, went to Washington on the Brazos. They sent the courier with the letters. And I want you to understand that for them, it was much easier to get someone out than it was to get someone in. So on March the 3rd, Travis penned 3 letters that I know of, one to the convention, one specifically to the convention, essentially letting them know what their status was, one to his friend Jesse Grimes, and then one to David Ayers about Travis's young son at the time. And it's kind of interesting. I'm not going to unpack all 3. I'm going to focus on one in particular today, because the dispatch that went to the convention was essentially a situation report. He sent a sit rep to essentially explain the situation that they were in a little more depth, give them an update on the unfolding scenario. And the one, I'll briefly mention the one that he wrote to David Ayers, but it's the one that he wrote to Jesse Grimes that I'm going to focus on today. And I want to set the stage for you, because, as I said, the thing a moment ago about Travis and the men of the Alamo not really getting any information in is pretty important to understand, because the convention issued the Declaration of Independence on March the 2nd. Okay, so you can take a look at what that timeline was. Perhaps you can even make the argument that a lot of the motivation for declaring independence was the initial letter that came from Travis. At least it probably had some bearing on that decision making. I'm sure it probably entered the debates. But March the 3rd, Travis and the defenders of the Alamo had no idea that Texas had declared independence. They didn't know. And it was in this vein, with still believing that the convention was perhaps on the fence about what they needed to do, and perhaps needed some motivation to make some inspiration. He penned this letter to Jesse Grimes, which I think you could look at it as a personal correspondence, but surely it would have crossed Travis's mind that Grimes would potentially share this idea or this mindset with others at the convention, other delegates. But it's important, before I get into the letter, and I'm going to read it in its entirety, I will tell you that this letter has given me a tremendous amount of motivation, comfort, even to a certain extent, but also ammunition. During the entire Reimagine the Alamo debacle that took place, the total morons that penned the book Forget the Alamo, listening to a state rep in a committee hearing claim that the entire Battle of the Alamo was about keeping slaves. This letter to me provided some of the best ammunition to absolutely expose those people as frauds, as just absolute either buffoons or frauds, one of the two, right? So I'm gonna read this letter to you. This is the full text of the William Barrett Travis letter to Jesse Grimes, and this is what it says, and it's personal, right? And it's written in that tone. He says, "Do me the favor to send the enclosed," which he doesn't say what the enclosed is, but you can. There are some ideas of what it might be, but it says, "Do me the favor to send the enclosed to its proper destination instantly. I am still here, in fine spirits and well-to-do, with 145 men. I have held this place for 10 days against a force variously estimated from 1,500 to 6,000, and shall continue to hold it till I get relief from my country, or I will perish in its defense. We have had a shower of bombs and cannonballs continually falling among us the whole time, yet none of us has fallen. We have been miraculously preserved. You have no doubt seen my official report on the action of the 24th, in which we repulsed the enemy with considerable loss. On the night of the 25th, they made another attempt to charge us in the rear of the fort, but we received them gallantly by a discharge of grape shot and musketry, and they took to their scrapers immediately. They are now encamped in entrenchments on all sides of us. All our couriers have gotten out without being caught, and a company of 32 men from Gonzales got in 2 nights ago. And Colonel Bonham got in today by coming between the Powder House and the enemy's upper encampment. So let the convention go on and make a declaration of independence, and we will then understand, and the world will understand, what we are fighting for. If independence is not declared, I shall lay down my arms, and so will the men under my command. But under the flag of independence, we are ready to peril our lives 100 times a day, and to drive away the monster who is fighting us under a blood-red flag, threatening to murder all prisoners and make Texas a waste desert. I shall have to fight the enemy on his own terms, yet I am ready to do it. And if my countrymen do not rally to my relief, I am determined to perish in the defense of this place, and my bones shall reproach my country for her neglect. With 500 men more, I will drive Sesma beyond the Rio Grande, and I will visit vengeance on the enemy fighting against us. Let the government declare them public enemies. Otherwise, she is acting a suicidal part. I shall treat them as such unless I have superior orders to the contrary. My respect to all friends, confusion to all enemies. God bless you. So, that letter was, as I said, one of three, but it really, for me, in many ways, eclipses the more famous victory or death letter. Perhaps, maybe there are just too many sort of finite details in this letter. Maybe it was because it was a personal correspondence and not something generally addressed. But there is something very compelling about this letter. And obviously, we could go through and unpack the fact that the immortal 32 showed up from Gonzales. And odd side note, my first ancestor in Texas who fought in the Texas Revolution was part of a company that made it to Gonzales after the immortal 32 had left. And it was in Gonzales when they were getting ready to go reinforce the Alamo that they had gotten word that the Alamo had fallen, and instead went to Washington on the Brazos and joined the larger Texian army. But, it is, as I said, after, before going down that rabbit trail, I do believe that this letter eclipses the victory or death letter. And I think it does so because it exposes the true motivations of those that would essentially, against, depending on what the estimated figures were, the estimation in this letter was that the Mexican army had anywhere from 1,500 to 6,000 troops. That's a pretty significant numerical advantage over the 145 to 185 defenders of the Alamo. It's overwhelming. And it's always been one of those things where you want to seek what the motivations were. You go back and you look at the Persian invasion of Greece, and you look at the tale of the 300 Spartans. We know that it was more than 300 Spartans, but you look at their defense of the pass of Thermopylae, which the Alamo has been compared to, ever since it happened. But you look at that and you wonder what their motivations were. And it was very clear, historically speaking, that the motivation of the Greeks were not to be subjugated by the Persian invaders, right? But it's very rare that you get to see the Alamo defenders in the light portrayed by this letter. He implores the convention, and as I said earlier, I can't help but think that he knew when he wrote this to Jesse Grimes that Jesse Grimes would communicate this information to the body of delegates, to the provisional government, to everyone there, right? I can't help but think that was crossing his mind, but he was very bold in his statements, right? And I want to key in on this one part where he says, let the convention go on and make a declaration of independence, and we will then understand, and the world will understand what we are fighting for. That line, that couple of statements right there, they say a lot. They are packed with so much meaning, because he's essentially saying, we are here fighting for independence. That's why we're here. What we need you guys to do at the convention is give essentially a voice or a seal of approval to that motivation, to that cause that they are willing to peril their lives for. And he even goes on to say it. If independence is not declared, I shall lay down my arms, and so will the men under my command. I mean, at what point of the Alamo story did you ever hear about those in the garrison willing to surrender? We talk about the line in the sand moment, right? It's almost as though you have, the siege begins. Santa Anna he says, look, we demand a surrender at discretion, which meant that they'd let the men go, but they would, basically execute the officers. Travis fires a cannon shot. We all sort of generally see that as the start of the battle. Then you have Travis penning the famous letter. Then you have sort of in the public narrative of this, you have Travis drawing a line in the sand and people, giving them an option to leave. And then the Alamo falls and that's it. But you never hear in the Alamo narrative this idea that, they were willing to surrender. They were willing to lay down their arms if the convention did not declare independence. Right? If the convention decided they wanted to continue to wring hands, or they said, hey, we wanted to go, we want to seek devolution. We still want to press for our rights as a state of the United States of Mexico. If the convention had done that, Travis is essentially saying that he and all the defenders would surrender. They would lay down their arms because they were saying that no level of subjugation, given all of the offense that had been given by the Mexican government, the overthrowing of the Constitution of 1824. It just goes on and on. I'm not going to recount all the grievances of the Texas Revolution, but he was essentially saying that partial subjugation was not acceptable. After everything that had been done, nothing short of independence was acceptable to justify them being holed up in a crumbling adobe mission, fighting off anywhere from 1,500 to 6,000 Mexican troops generaled by the Napoleon of the West. And he even says it. He says, but under the flag of independence, we are ready to peril our lives 100 times a day. What was the motivation? The motivation was independence. When people say, well, what was the Alamo about? Or you have detractors on social media saying, well, you guys lost the Alamo. Did we? Really? I mean, what better way to go out than to stand up for your principles, to stand up for the right of self-determination, for self-government, for liberty, for your rights? It's very clear to me that all of the men, they were massacred. They died at the Battle of the Alamo. But it was still a victory. It was still a win, because not once did they surrender the main principle for which they contended, which was independence. And in fact, it was their willingness to sacrifice their lives unto death that spurred on and motivated and unified what was left of the Texian army. And while they still had to run for about a month plus, in the end, it was "Remember the Alamo" that the Texian army cried when they marched across the plains of San Jacinto and wiped out the Mexican army. It was always about independence. Always. And the fact that they were willing to surrender rather than not fight for independence, I think speaks to us in our current time, our current place in history. We have the same division and debate here in Texas, whether we should continue to press for our rights in a federal system that tramples all over them, where we may get temporary relief here and there, but the long-term trajectory is the erosion of our sovereignty, of our individual liberties, of our existence as Texas. People are still divided, right? That or independence. We're in that same situation. There are clear analogs. where there are people that are willing to accept a degree of subjugation, of surrender of their sovereignty rather than push for independence. And so I believe that this letter for us as Texas nationalists really calls I think it really, I'm not going to say chastises us, but I think it really challenges us to ask ourselves, are we these people? Are we honoring their spirit? Are we honoring their sacrifice? Because you have to remember, depending on when this was penned, the March the 6th in the early morning, Travis was one of the first to fall in the final Mexican push to take the Alamo. How willing are you to give your life unto death for the cause of independence? Are you willing to make that stand? And I want to be clear about this. I hear far too many gung ho people say, "Well, I would die for Texas." Well, you know what? That's easy. Dying's easy. You want to die, go in there and take too many ibuprofen. Go chug a bottle of ibuprofen. That's easy. Independence is not a suicide cult. The real challenge, and the challenge that was answered by these men at the Alamo, as evidenced by what Travis said, was, are you willing to live for independence unto death? You guys, you wonder sometimes about the things that I say. When I say that August 24th, 1996 was the day that I determined to see Texas as a free, independent, self-governing nation, or until the grave digger pats me in the face with a shovel. You want to know why I say that? Because of this letter. Because that was effectively the pledge that I made. Now, I didn't know about this letter until, a few months after that. But if we're going to honor their legacy, if we're going to honor the sacrifice that they made, the blood-soaked ground of the Alamo, then how committed are you? I know that I have effectively given my life since that moment to this cause, to the cause of independence. At the moment this stops being about independence, I'll be like Travis. But here's the thing. He was looking for a seal of approval from a convention, and that's not it for me. Because for all of us, choosing to live and work for independence, to sacrifice a piece of ourselves, our time on this planet for this particular cause, is an individual choice, right? You could plug into the TNM, right? You could plug into the Texas Nationals movement. You can do these. There's all kinds of things you can do, but ultimately it boils down to a personal choice. And I really believe, I can't prove it because some people say the line in the sand story is a legend. They say it's not real. I seem to believe, I believe that it's real. And I believe that it is directly connected to the sentiment in this particular letter. I think that although the Alamo did not get its reinforcements and Travis didn't get the reinforcements, and they never knew that independence had been declared, I think on that final day, that 12th day of the siege, I think that Travis wanted to give every single person inside the Alamo a personal choice, a time to make a decision, an opportunity to fulfill these words, to determine how far they were willing to go for independence. And he did. And we'll talk about that, right? I'll be, this will be published on March the 3rd. I do my weekly live stream in a couple of days, which will happen to coincide with Line in the Sand Day. And I'll talk more about that on that live stream. But for right here and right now, I believe that it is vitally important for us to look at this letter. And as people who believe in independence, or even those that are on the fence about the issue, I think this letter is an opportunity for us to determine our personal character, to determine to become that essentially sets a litmus test for us to measure where we are in honoring their sacrifice. I can tell you, I don't believe that that in their minds they were willing to die for what we have today. They weren't willing to die to give their lives for partial subjugation. They were willing to surrender. And this is an important fact here. When he said, if independence is not declared, I shall lay down my arms. I want you to understand why it's important that he said that. When I talked about the sort of publicly accepted timeline of the Alamo a moment ago, I talked about how Santa Anna had demanded a surrender at discretion. And a surrender at discretion meant that the soldiers could walk, right? They might be taken prisoner. If Goliad was any example, they would probably all still be executed, but they would walk and the officers would be put to death. And so when Travis says that he is willing to lay down his arms, he knows that he will face certain execution. If the garrison were to surrender, at that moment, they could have probably gone back to Santa Anna and said, okay, we'll take your surrender at discretion. And they'd have lined the officers up and shot them, right? If that offer might have still been on the table, who knows? But by this statement right here, Travis knew for certain that if independence wasn't declared, that he was assured death. I mean, in his mind, he was assured death probably either way. But he still had hope, because he even talks about, with 500 men more, I'll drive Sesma beyond the Rio Grande, and I will visit vengeance on the enemy fighting against us. He still had hope that there was an opportunity. Now, that hope may have evaporated on the 12th day of the siege. Hence the line in the sand moment. But he was still making his case. He was making his case for independence and for reinforcement. And I have to say this as a bit of a final note on this. I love how he signs off. My respects to all friends and confusion to all enemies. I mean, you got to love it. But I do believe that this letter, it is to me probably the most significant correspondence in relation to the Alamo. I think it speaks to us in our day and age, perhaps more than the famous victory or death letter. I mean, the victory or death letter is inspiring, but if you want real inspiration, find something that you can measure your character against. I get inspired by certain events, historical events, current events, whatever. But what really changes the world and changes a person is having benchmarks for character. And this, my friends, is a benchmark for character. Can you say that you love independence as much as Travis did? Can you say that the Alamo was ultimately about anything else other than independence, when their continued fighting or their surrender depended solely on that one criteria? I will say this. This is always an emotional week for me. Every single year it is, because I personally look at each one of those days and I take time to stop and reflect on what was going on in the minds and the hearts of those men and women that were in the Alamo. It is a really sobering time. But I would encourage you, look, as a final note here, I would encourage you to read the letter. I will make sure that the text of this letter is posted in the comments. We'll get it posted up on the TNM website. You'll find it. We'll probably, when we post this episode of the podcast on the TNM news site at news.tnm.me, we will include the text of the letter there. But I wanted to I wanted to touch on this before we wrap up, because I know that some people will ask me, what was really in the other, what was in the other letter, right? Um, and I said there were three, and there were three. I told you that one was essentially a sit rep for the Alamo garrison that went to the convention, so they would know. But the other was very important, and it was very short. It was to David Ayers, and this is what it said. He said, "Take care of my little boy. If the country should be saved, I may make for him a splendid fortune. But if the country be lost, and I should perish, he will have nothing but the proud recollection that he is the son of a man who died for his country." So, friends, during this Alamo season, if you want to call it that, or this, Texas History Month or whatever it is, I don't seek to just give you a historical story. I'm really looking to show you that what happened then matters now. And it can matter to each and every single one of us as we recommit and rededicate ourselves to being the strongest advocates and workers for Texas independence that we could possibly be. I hope that God gives me the strength in the toughest hours that Travis and those defenders of the Alamo had on March the 3rd and March the 4th and March the 5th and that fatal morning of March the 6th. And so, friends, with that, I will thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Texas News Podcast. Different, we didn't have any current events other than the fact that I believe that this probably should inform our perspective on all current events. We should be thinking about the independence of Texas and the sacrifice that was made. And be examining all news and all perspectives through that, how we hold politicians accountable, or our relationship with the federal government, or geopolitics. What does that do for the legacy of these people that gave their lives for our independence? I think it's a good perspective to have. But again, thank you for tuning in, and we'll be back. Our next episode, we've got some phenomenal interviews coming up. Leader of Free Louisiana, the head of one of the leaders in the movement in Nuevo Leon, Mexico. Remember, the media said those guys don't exist. We're going to have one of the leaders of that movement for Nuevo Leon independence. We're going to have one of the leaders, one of the leading academics and intellectuals advocating for Puerto Rico's exit. We've got interviews out the wazoo, plus lots and lots of news and updates related to the Texas legislature. So, just all you got to do to make sure that you don't miss these is subscribe wherever you find it, right? If you watch these on YouTube, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any of the other podcast distribution networks, be sure to like and share and do all the things necessary so you get notified when these happen. And sharing is very important, because we are seeing evidence that our content is being suppressed, even on the alleged bastion of free speech, the platform X. And of course, we will be distributing this on Rumble as well. So be sure you go find it over there. So with that, my friends, I would encourage you to help us keep this content out there, not just liking and sharing, but become a member of the Texas Nationalist Movement. You can go to tnm.me/join and become a member today for as little as $4.21. You can help us advance the cause of Texas independence. These men were willing to give their lives. Are you willing to give $4.21? It's a small price to pay if we all do it, and it advances us closer to becoming a self-governing independent nation, to fulfill the dream of independence that these people sacrificed their lives for. And with that, I will leave you with the words of Sam Houston when he said that Texas will again lift its head and stand among the nations. I believe that time is now, and the question is, will you stand with her?